Hello there everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's-A-Mii here, and today we're doing a double upload to discuss a new report from the game business regarding third-party sales on Nintendo Switch 2. Seemingly, third-party games are vastly underperforming to the publisher's expectations on the Switch 2, and a lot of people are jumping to the conclusion that it is because of game keycards. And game keycards certainly may be playing a factor in it, but today I wanted to read through the reports, see all of the data we have, and talk about it, and whether or not game keycards actually are the driving factor for why third-party games are underperforming, or if there's another bigger issue at play here when it comes to why some of these late ports are selling bad to the Nintendo audience. Of course, if you are new here and you enjoy Nintendo Switch 2 collecting content and news videos when they do pertain to physical media, I would appreciate you liking the video and subscribing. Let's get into it. Okay, so I'll have everything linked down below for you to read for yourself, but of course we're gonna go through it right now. First things first, we need to take a look at the initial reports from Christopher Dring over at the Game Business, where he says it was the biggest console launch of all time, but was Nintendo Switch 2 a success for third parties? Third-party sales on Nintendo have always been kind of hit or miss. You will every once in a while have those runaway successes like Witcher 3 or even Doom and Skyrim back in 2017 and 2019 for whenever those ports came out, and those did really well. But overall, it can always be kind of hit or miss for how well a third-party port, especially of a major AAA game, will do on a Nintendo platform. This has been a thing forever. One of the biggest conversations around a Switch 2 is whether the machine will deliver for third parties. Major companies including EA, Take-Two, Microsoft, Ubisoft, Sega, Capcom, Bandai Namco, Square Enix, CD Projekt Red, and Konami have committed support for the platform. Funny to include Microsoft. I guess Tony Hawk is coming out next month, so there's that. He continues on here. In our travels, they've talked about how Nintendo is actively trying to push third-party games at this time around, as where with Switch 1, they really emphasized first-party games, but also indie games early on there, if you were around back then. The launch of the Switch 2 was huge, with 3.5 million consoles sold in just a few days, making it the fastest-selling games machine in history. We know that Mario Kart World was clearly the #1 game, but what about those third-party releases? Games such as Cyberpunk 2077, Bravely Default, Hitman, Street Fighter, Hogwarts Legacy, Civ 7, Split Fiction, Sonic, Yakuza, and so on. There was a massive launch lineup for this console, which, as we'll get into, I do think really played to certain games' detriment, where there's so many options, the pie is being divided and sold to so many different people. There were so many launch games that inherently certain games would suffer from that because there are just more options, which is a good thing for us as the people that play games, but it can be a bad thing for publishers if there are, especially games in a similar genre or with a similar fan base, also launching on the same day. People are going to make their choice, and in the case of one little matchup, I think it was pretty clear what the answer was for a lot of people, but we'll get to that reading on here. So we had a lot of numbers here, broken down from Circana as well as Nielsen, and just a lot of other companies that track this data. So first things first, 62% of Switch 2 physical game sales in the US for launch week were from first-party games, excluding the Mario Kart World bundle. That's coming from Circana. 48% of Switch 2 physical game sales in the UK for launch week were from first-party games, excluding the bundle. 86% of Switch 2 physical game sales in the UK were from first-party games, including the Mario Kart World bundle. So is that a 38% increase, just including the Mario Kart's bundle, which is pretty funny. By comparison, for the launch of Switch 1, 89% of UK physical game sales were from first-party games. So actually, that number is lower than it was for Switch 1, but also Switch 1 had an awful lineup of launch titles, especially from the third-party side of things, where really the only notable game there was Super Bomberman R. You had Skylanders and Just Dance, but really Super Bomberman R was your big third-party game on launch day. For the launch month of Switch 1 in the US, 81% of US physical game sales were from first-party games, so about 20%, or really 19% of games in launch month for Switch was third-party, so very low percentage overall. CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077 was the best-selling third-party game during the launch of Switch 2, beating launch sales of The Witcher 3 on Switch 1. That's according to Nielsen. Sega was the #3 biggest publisher on Switch 2 at launch, according to Circana, and when it comes to games released both physically and digitally, over 80% of Switch 2 game sales came from physical retailers, and that's data shared by publishers. Quote, although third-party publishers appear to have done slightly better during the launch of Switch 2 compared to Switch 1, it's hard to describe these statistics as positive. Most third-party Switch 2 games posted very low numbers. One third-party publisher characterized the numbers as, quote, below our lowest estimates, despite strong hardware sales. The improvement over the Switch 1 launch is also slightly misleading. For starters, there were more consoles sold this time, that's also true. Plus, the Switch 1 only launched with 5 physical games, being Breath of the Wild, 1-2 Switch, Just Dance 2017, Skylanders, and Bomberman. By comparison, the Switch 2 has a wider selection with 13 physical games available at launch. Around 80% of all Switch 2 console sales were of the Mario Kart World bundle, and we would expect some of the remaining 20% also picked up Mario Kart World. So, I mean, I remember back in 2017 when the Switch 1 came out, Breath of the Wild had a higher attach rate than the console itself. Like, there were more copies sold of Breath of the Wild on Switch than the Switch itself, which was really funny because you're buying the Switch 2 right now for Mario Kart World, which is also going to hurt these third parties because Nintendo fans can and will show up for third-party support when and where it matters, but also, ultimately, still, the status quo is they're buying it for their big Nintendo games, and when you have the first new Mario Kart game, the sequel to one of the best-selling games of all time, they're gonna play the new Mario Kart game, and they're going to be satisfied with that for a while. Reading on here, he says, people buy Nintendo consoles for Nintendo games, and it would be expected that new users, particularly those who are buying a Nintendo console on day one, would begin with Nintendo software. As a result, it's possible third-party game sales will occur later, once players have had their fill of Mario Kart. 100% that is what's going to happen. Quotes, meanwhile, Nintendo did not send out Switch 2 units to media ahead of release. That meant there were no reviews of any of these third-party titles at launch. For consumers who may have wanted to pick up a second game alongside Mario Kart, there were no critical reviews available for them to base their purchasing decisions on. I don't know how much that really played into it because immediately on day one, you had people doing unboxings like me, but also people doing their impressions and really testing like stuff like Hitman and Split Fiction. So I don't know how much that really matters, but it certainly might have affected the sales a little bit here. One of the drawbacks for third-party publishers is the fact that Switch 2 is backwards compatible with some older games, including popular titles like Scarlet and Violet, receiving technical improvements on the new hardware. In other words, even if Switch 2 owners are looking at other games to play post-Mario Karts, they have other options available beyond the slate of third-party titles. This was not the case for Switch 1. That is totally true. I have seen so many people, even within like my friend groups, going back, playing and buying Scarlet and Violet, or buying Echoes of Wisdom, or buying Hyrule Warriors, just because they run better now. So not only are all of these third-party games competing with Mario Kart World, one of the biggest Nintendo launches in the past decade, they're also competing with all of the great Switch 1 games that have amassed over the past 8 years. So it's really not even just the launch lineup as we perceive it with the games that are available physically on Switch 2. It's also the entire back catalog on the Nintendo Switch 1, which means this was just a very competitive launch lineup when Nintendo was releasing, 10 patches that make their old games run and look better. Like, people are going to want to check those out because, well, people like Nintendo games. Quote, it's also worth noting that almost all of the Switch 2 third-party games were ports of older games. Considering the high crossover between Switch owners and PlayStation/Xbox players, it's not unreasonable to suggest that a lot of Switch 2 owners already own these titles. We'll talk about that in just a bit. What's more, many of the titles are using game keycards, which require users to download the game once they put in the cartridge. This has been proven unpopular amongst core audiences who appreciate the plug-and-play nature of Nintendo Switch. It's noteworthy that Cyberpunk 2077, the one third-party game that has done reasonable numbers, runs off the cartridge and doesn't require a download. It doesn't require a download, however, there is a day one patch, keep that in mind. Here's a quote from our interview with CD Projekt Red's Jan Rosner, quotes, a plug-and-play experience is a really cool thing. We've already seen from the original Switch that Nintendo players are quite receptive to that. He added, quote, do not underestimate the physical edition. It's not going anywhere, and Nintendo players are very appreciative of physical editions that are done right. Christopher Drain closes off here saying we'll be keeping a close eye on third-party game performance on Switch 2 in the weeks and months to come. So that was the initial article, and everybody started running with this, being like, okay, third-party games are doing bad because of game keycards. People don't want to buy game keycards. Now, that very well may be playing a key part in why certain third-party games are selling poorly. However, I do think we can't jump to that conclusion. I do think there is more to it than just simply people are boycotting game keycards, because we have to remember the internet, no matter where you are on the internet, is an echo chamber. Between the 4 million or so people that have bought a Switch 2, how many of them are actually on Twitter boycotting game keycards and even reading any of that stuff? I saw so many people at my midnight launch picking up copies of Yakuza and Bravely Defaults, or at Target, I keep seeing copies sell out of certain games, even like Puyo Puyo Tetris. So I don't know if we can safely say the sales are poor because of game keycards. Once again, that is very possibly, and maybe even likely, a reason for sales to be lower than expected, but I don't know if that's the main issue. Now, we do have a little bit more reading material here before we get into like the full discussion. So Circana's Matt Piscatella said, quotes, third-party share of Switch 2 software in the US is far better than it was during the Switch 1 launch. Kind of disingenuous to really argue that when the third-party lineup is so much better, but also the console sold more units. So inherently, I mean, I would certainly hope that there were more third-party sales for Switch 2 than Switch 1. Quotes, the third-party unit share of Switch 2 physical software during week 1 reached just shy of 40%. For month 1 of the Switch launch, it was less than 20%. Of course, these are all coming from his Blue Sky accounts over here. He says, quote, hate to contribute to a discourse, but third-party share of Switch 2 software in the US is far better than it was during Switch 1 launch. Kind of just going over what we just said. He says, quote, it's far too early to claim best or worst, this or that or whatever when it comes to Switch 2. The thing hasn't even been out for 3 weeks yet, and that's all coming from Circana, which tracks retail sales in the US. So even someone who works at Circana is saying, like, listen, it's too early to really say just why these sales are bad, especially when they are above Switch 1. But also, once again, that's because there were certainly just more games than the Switch 1 had on Switch 2. And then the final thing I wanted to read through real quick is from Daniel Ahmad. He is a director of research and insights at Nico Partners. He's always been around talking about game sales data and stuff like that for as long as I've been on social media. So he's an OG. He's been very reliable in the past. He had a very long write-up that I wanted to read through that I think just gives us more clarity on the entire situation. He says, quote, so many people are taking Cyberpunk 2077 at number 1 to mean that no one is buying game keycards, but that's not the full story. Going to break it down in this post. 1. This launch mirrors the Switch 1 launch in early years where late ports of third-party games did not necessarily sell well. Only new or exclusive Switch 1 games from third parties sold well. Cyberpunk 2077, being the number 1 best-selling third-party game, is not unexpected given it was the technical showcase for third-party on Switch 2 and is already the best-selling on other platforms versus the other games in the third-party lineup. That's totally true. Cyberpunk is far and away the biggest launch title that's not Mario Kart, like in terms of how much it's sold on PlayStation and PC and Xbox, but also just how much they promoted it and pushed. I mean, they've really pushed Cyberpunk as like, this is our big title for the Switch 2. This is our big third-party technical showcase. What can the Switch do with a AAA third-party game? They pushed it more than any other game on the platform other than Mario Kart. Number 3 here, he says Mario Kart World, alike with Breath of the Wild, was the game to buy for Switch 2 with an 80% attach rate. Even with Cyberpunk 2077 being the best-selling third-party game, its attach rate and the individual attach rate for all third-party games was less than 5%. So even with them saying like Cyberpunk 2077 best-selling third-party game, it doesn't sound like it did like that much better than the other third-party games on the platform. It's going to have a higher physical ratio for sure because of the whole cartridge thing, and people are very happy about that. That's certainly something that the hardcore collecting community is paying attention to. And I think long-term, we'll see out of all of these launch titles, Cyberpunk will be the best-selling one, both physically and digitally, because it is Cyberpunk. It's just one of those all-time games that people will buy for years and years to come. However, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to say that it sold so much better because it was on the cartridge. Maybe it helped, but I think it's more about the fact that it's Cyberpunk versus Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 or Bravely Default, right? This is a much more popular game that appeals to way more people than a lot of these other niche titles that do have game keycard releases. In other words, Switch 2 buyers were satisfied with Mario Kart World and legacy Switch 1 titles at launch and did not buy any of the other Switch 2 launch games in high numbers. Game keycards are maybe the 4th or 5th factor for why third-party games didn't sell well, not to mention that while Cyberpunk 2077 was the bestseller, other third-party games like Street Fighter, which was a keycard, weren't far behind. So we don't know the exact numbers here, but he is saying that Street Fighter was not far behind in terms of the sales versus Cyberpunk 2077, and that was a game keycard. That's also a fighting game, way more niche. Street Fighter, of course, to us as hardcore gamers, that's a very household name. Street Fighter is nowhere near as popular as something like Cyberpunk 2077, so that's actually really impressive there. He says, quote, the reality is that keycards aren't a major issue in the grand scheme of things outside of enthusiast circles, and having a physical version of the game that requires you to download the game isn't an issue for the majority of gamers. Should all physical games have the game on the cartridge? Of course. Should gamers advocate for digital ownership rights for digital games? Of course. Will more games have a full physical release? Yes, once Nintendo ramps up manufacturing for cartridges and lowers royalty fees. But as above, the game keycard issue isn't the reason for low third-party sales in general, or Cyberpunk 2077 being number 1. It's not because of game keycards. That certainly might be playing a part in it, and maybe that equates to thousands of copies sold that would have been sold otherwise, that are sitting on shelves now. But the greater issue, and it's certainly something that I think applies to more people, 1, Mario Kart released. People don't have the time to play, 10 games in a week. It's only been a couple of weeks since the console came out. Most people are still playing Mario Kart World, and they will continue playing that game until Donkey Kong Bonanza comes out, because, once again, most people aren't sitting there playing games for 8 hours a day. They get their one game maybe a month or so, and that's enough for them. But also, the third-party lineup there, while I think it's all very high-quality stuff, I think a lot of the ports are very good. You even have, million-plus sellers with stuff like, Split Fiction is a newer release. You have Cyberpunk, you have Yakuza 0, you have Hogwarts Legacy, which is a huge game on Switch 1. They are all old games. And I think a lot of people at this point realize and understand that, especially when it comes to Nintendo and late ports of third-party games, you can wait for a sale on like the Sega games. Those Sega games are going to be like $20 on Black Friday, I'm sure. So I think a lot of people just understand that, like, listen, I'm playing Mario Kart World. Maybe you buy Welcome Tour. Maybe you get the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom upgrades. Maybe you're messing around with the GameCube games. There's no reason to rush into buying a lot of these third-party games because they're already old games. Maybe they already played them on another platform, but also they will go on sale for cheaper than Nintendo's first-party software ever goes. And I do genuinely think, and it's funny because I've talked about this in videos in the past before the console even had its full unveiling in April, there is something to be said about there being too many launch titles. And maybe this is what we're seeing post-launch, where the cadence of releases, even from first but also third-party, is certainly kind of, more sporadic. But when you release too many games at once, they end up cannibalizing each other, even if they're not necessarily the exact same target demographic or the same type of game. I think the Switch 2 launch is very good because it has so many different types of genres and different types of games. One person who plays Yakuza might not be interested in Cyberpunk, but that's for somebody else who wants to play Rune Factory, who wants to play Bravely Defaults, who wants to play Puyo Puyo Tetris, who wants to play Sonic, right? Like, there is so many different genres available on Switch 2 that in theory, you're checking all these boxes for all these different types of gamers who want to play these certain types of games. However, inherently, when you release that many games, you will, no matter what, end up hurting other games around it, right? You're releasing like 20 games on day one. That is going to have a negative effect, even if it's on like a micro level. Let's say Yakuza 0 comes out and 100 people buy that instead of Cyberpunk. That is going to affect everything, which is why we're seeing, as Daniel notes here, less than 5% attach rate for all third-party games on the platform. People always talk about how there should be like a ton of games available on launch day. Why didn't Nintendo release DK Bonanza on launch alongside Mario Kart World? Because of this. People don't have the time or money to be spending that much money on multiple games on day one. They just bought a $500 console. Why would there be that many games available? And I think we're going to see that continuing out through 2025, where the third-party releases are a little bit more sporadic, so they have room to breathe. Right now for September, it's looking like Star Wars and Borderlands, and I think Daemon X Machina are those are like our big three. Maybe Final Fantasy Tactics is in there, but that's like 4 games for an entire month, and none of them share the same release date, I don't think. Actually, Star Wars might with Daemon X Machina, but those are such different audiences that it shouldn't really matter. I don't know. I just feel like with how many games released, it was inevitable that certain games would end up cannibalizing others. I think in a case like Rune Factory and Fantasy Life, I can imagine Marvelous is not happy that Level 5 waited until the last possible second to say, hey guys, Fantasy Life is a launch title, because Fantasy Life is doing way better than Rune Factory. And those certainly have the same audience of, like, maybe not the exact same niche within like cozy games and farming games and action games. Maybe there are a little difference, but the person that's interested in Rune Factory is probably also interested in Fantasy Life. And I think the same person that's interested in Rune Factory, well, there's a good chance they also want to play Bravely Default, right? So there's this trickling effect where, yes, the launch lineup is very good from a diversity standpoint, and there's so many different types of games, but also inevitably there will be overlap, and that will hurt sales of every game in the launch lineup except for Mario Kart World. The real question will be, what do third-party sales look like for something like Borderlands 4, if it ends up releasing day and date? Right now, it seems like it might be a little bit later, but let's say Borderlands 4 is a day and date release on Switch 2 and PS5. What does that look like? What does, let's just say, the next Assassin's Creed look like if that ends up coming? Call of Duty, how do these things that release day and date on the platform sell compared to PlayStation and Xbox versions? Because I can sit here right now and say I have no thought in my mind that the likes of Elden Ring and Final Fantasy VII Remake, those are almost certainly going to be game keycard releases, but also I think they're going to sell really well on Nintendo. Nintendo and Final Fantasy VII Remake, that should have happened sooner, frankly. I don't know if they could have gotten it on Switch 1. That would have been a nightmare, I'm sure, but that audience is going to speak well, I think, to Final Fantasy VII. And Elden Ring, well, that's a Cyberpunk tier game. No matter what, that game is going to sell well. Over time, it will probably end up selling like 5-10 million units just on Switch 2 alone, because it's a game people will rebuy. They will play through it again with friends, right? Like, Elden Ring and Final Fantasy VII Remake, those are huge games, and they're going to sell well regardless of really anything else around it, because they're eternal games. Those are games that will forever sell, and even if they don't have the strongest sales out the gates, they will over time do well. I do think that might even apply to something like Yakuza 0, where that is the starting point of the franchise. Over time, especially with sales, will Sega turn around and be like, hey, we're actually really happy with how Yakuza 0 is doing on the platform? I certainly think that's possible. But then you also have stuff like Sonic. That's not going to move the needle. No one cares. It's just an up-res version of Sonic running at a better frame rates, and that's already an old game from the 360. Like, that was never going to sell well. Even if it was on the cartridge, it wouldn't have sold well. So I just feel like there's more to it than hopping on Twitter and being like, yippee, game keycard's dead. I just don't think it's that clear cut. I understand why people want that to be the case. They want game keycards to completely bomb so that publishers will put their games on the cartridge. But based on the data we have, if you actually read through everything, I don't really think that the publishers are going to look at the sales and think, oh, it's because we didn't put Puyo Puyo Tetris on the cartridge. No, it's because there were too many other games taking away attention from Puyo Puyo Tetris 2S, which really should be the game that sold the most at the console launch. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't really planning on making a video on this, but I went on Twitter this morning, I saw all the headlines, I was reading through all of it, and every reply is being like, yes, the games are selling bad because of game keycards. Once again, that may be playing a factor in it, but even as Daniel said here, it might be like the 4th or 5th factor in why these games aren't selling well. I don't even know if I would go as far as 4th or 5th. I mean, I think it might be a bigger issue than that. I think it'll depend on the publisher as well. A publisher like NIS America doing Disgaea and Trails as game keycards, I think will affect NIS's sales more than it will affect a company like, let's say, Hogwarts Legacy and WB. Like, Hogwarts Legacy, I think that game's going to sell basically the same regardless, whereas NIS America has an audience of people that do collect physical media and do like owning their stuff. So, I don't know. I think there's a lot more to it than just the game key card situation. I think there's a pacing issue, a quantity issue. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think third-party games are selling poorly because of game key cards, or do you think there is more to it than that? I mean, we literally have the stats to prove it's not just because of game key cards, but that certainly, once again, is playing a role. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Of course, as always, subscribe here for more Nintendo collecting and videos covering Nintendo news and what that pertains to Nintendo collecting. I would really appreciate it if you like the video as well. I did also post my Nintendo Switch 2 console review this morning, so if you're interested in that, definitely give that a watch. You can follow me on Twitter at BoTalksGames. Check out my Nintendo news channel where I cover gaming news, not just physical related stuff. So check out that if you're interested in more like just, oh, I made a video about Donkey Kong Bonanza yesterday. If you want to go see that, definitely subscribe there. And until next time, folks, peace.